The thug leveled the gun at her German shepherd and offered a grim choice. "Pick which one of you dies first." In a moment of pure desperation, the young widow threw herself over her beloved companion, ready to take the bullet herself. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the end. But she didn't know that a Navy SEAL had just stepped from the shadows behind them, and he wasn't there to negotiate. The late afternoon sun hung low over the small town of Havenwood, Ohio, casting long, heavy shadows that stretched across the worn brick roads like the hand of time itself. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth from the nearby cornfields, mixed with the sweet scent of honeysuckle that seemed to cling to the humid Midwestern breeze. It was the kind of slow-moving weather that forced everyone to match its pace. For Jack Donovan, however, slowing down was an impossibility. Jack was a man built for speed and precision, standing over 6 feet tall with a dense, muscular frame forged by years of carrying heavy packs and moving through hostile terrain. His dark, short-cropped hair was all business, and his sharp, slate-gray eyes never stopped scanning his surroundings. He was a Navy SEAL on mandatory administrative leave, a polite term the command used when they wanted him to stop before he broke. But the quiet of the civilian world was louder than any battlefield he'd ever known. He found himself walking through the town square, a patch of green dominated by a stoic Civil War monument where families gathered for picnics. But the crowds were thinning as the dinner hour approached. The gentle rustle of the maple leaves should have been soothing, but it only served to remind Jack how out of place he felt. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, trying to blend in, but his posture gave him away. He moved with a predator's grace, his head on a constant swivel, checking rooftops, parked cars, and the hands of passers-by. It was a hard habit to break, the instinct to find the threat before it found him. To quiet his racing mind, he turned into the adjacent public park, a space shaded by enormous, ancient oak trees. Their gnarled branches spread out like a canopy, and under the shade of these silent sentinels, Jack saw them. It was impossible not to notice the pair. A woman stood near the center of the green lawn, tossing a tennis ball with a mechanical, absent-minded motion. She stood out, though not in a way that demanded attention. Instead, she possessed a quiet, sorrowful beauty that drew the eye. She had dark, wavy hair pulled back loosely, revealing a pale neck and a face that seemed etched with a deep weariness. This was Clara Morgan. She wore a simple floral dress that billowed in the breeze, but her shoulders were rigid, betraying the sheer force of will it took to hold herself together. There was a fragility about her, like fine porcelain that had been dropped and glued back together. Yet, she still stood tall. At her side was a magnificent creature, a German shepherd named Atlas. The dog was massive, with a rich black and tan coat and ears that were perpetually pricked forward in a state of constant vigilance. He didn't run with the abandon of a puppy, but moved with the disciplined focus of a soldier. Each time he retrieved the ball, he would trot back to Clara's side and sit on her left, pressing his body against her leg as if to keep her anchored to the earth. Jack sat on an iron bench a few yards away, partially hidden by the shadow of an oak trunk. He wasn't trying to hide, but he wasn't ready to be seen, either. He watched Clara. She wasn't just playing with the dog. She was using the activity to distract herself from something else. Every few minutes, her throwing arm would falter, and her gaze would drift to a row of stately Victorian homes that lined the street adjacent to the park. Her expression shifted from numb emptiness to a sharp, pointed anxiety. It was a look Jack knew well. It was the look of someone assessing a perimeter they knew they couldn't hold. He wondered what she saw in those houses. A memory, a debt, a threat? He didn't know her, but he recognized the weight she was carrying. It was the same weight that sat on his own chest, the invisible pack of grief and hypervigilance. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead and sending a few acorns pattering to the ground. Atlas's head whipped around toward the sound, his body tensing, a low growl rumbling in his chest before he identified it as nothing more than the wind. Clara bent down and buried her hand in the thick fur of the dog's neck, her fingers clenching. It was clear the dog was more than a pet. He was her anchor. He was the only thing standing between her and whatever abyss of sorrow she was navigating. Jack felt a strange kinship. He'd had his team, or he used to, but out here in this world of bright colors and loud tourists, he felt like an alien species. Seeing the woman and the dog operate as a two-person unit against the world made him feel, for a moment, a little less alone. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised streaks of purple and orange. The park was almost empty now. Jack decided it was time to leave, to head back to the small rental apartment that felt too big for one person. He stood, and the motion caught the German shepherd's attention. Just then, Clara threw the ball. Her throw was off, her arm tired. The yellow sphere bounced erratically on the grass, skittering over tree roots until it rolled to a stop just a few feet from Jack's boots. Atlas tore after it, a blur of muscle and speed. The dog reached the ball, but he didn't snatch it up immediately. Instead, he stopped. He looked at the ball, then slowly lifted his head to look at the man standing over it. Jack didn't flinch. He didn't back away. He held his ground, his hands loose at his sides in a non-aggressive posture. He looked down at the dog. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. Atlas tilted his head, his amber eyes assessing Jack with an almost human intelligence. The dog sensed no threat, only a strange, quiet strength that mirrored its own. Atlas picked up the ball and stood there, waiting. "Atlas. Atlas, come." Clara's voice cut through the twilight. It was musical, but laced with a thread of panic. She was hurrying toward them, her dress catching on her legs, her face pale. She clearly didn't like her protector getting too close to a stranger, especially one who looked like he could snap a baseball bat in half. Jack slowly bent down, keeping his movements fluid to avoid startling the animal. He held out one hand, palm open. Atlas took a step forward and dropped the slobber-covered tennis ball into Jack's hand. It was a peace offering, a sign of trust from a creature that did not give it easily. Jack straightened up just as Clara reached them. She stopped short, breathing hard, her eyes wide. Up close, Jack could see the stress lines around her mouth and the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. "I'm so sorry," Clara stammered, reaching for the dog's collar. "He doesn't usually bother people. He's very protective." "He's not bothering me," Jack said. He looked at the ball in his hand, then held it out to her. "He's a good soldier." Clara paused, her hand hovering over the dog's neck. She looked at the ball, then up at Jack's face. For a heartbeat, the world around them went silent. The traffic noise faded. The rustling of the trees ceased. There was only the intensity of their locked gaze. In her eyes, Jack saw a reflection of his own brokenness, the pain of a survivor. In his, Clara saw a wall of strength that had been battered, but not broken. It wasn't a romantic spark, not yet. It was a recognition, a silent acknowledgement that they were both walking through a life that had lost its color. "Thank you," she whispered, taking the ball. Her fingers brushed against his, cool against his calloused warmth. A tremor seemed to pass through the air between them. "I'm Jack," he said, the introduction slipping out before he could stop it. "Clara," she replied. She looked down at the dog, who was now leaning contentedly against Jack's leg. "And this is Atlas." "It's a fitting name," Jack said with a nod. He took a step back, breaking the tension of the moment, giving her space. "You two get home safe. It's getting dark." "You too," Clara said. She watched him turn and walk away, his silhouette melting into the deepening shadows of the oaks. She had no idea who he was, but as she clipped the leash to Atlas's collar, she felt a strange sensation in her chest. For the first time in months, the crushing weight of her loneliness had lifted, just a fraction. She glanced back one last time, but the soldier was gone, leaving only the swaying trees and the first stars of the evening to watch over them. The next morning brought a deceptive quiet to the streets of Havenwood, the humidity hanging heavy and sweet like a damp wool blanket. Jack Donovan sat at a small iron table outside a corner diner, nursing a black coffee that had long gone cold. He wasn't there for the caffeine. He was there because the same instinct that had kept him alive in the Hindu Kush was screaming that the woman and the dog from the park were in danger. He couldn't explain it, and he didn't try to justify it to himself. He simply watched. Across the street, near the entrance to a local bakery, Clara Morgan sat with a stack of papers spread out before her. She looked smaller today, the morning light exposing the fragility she tried to hide behind oversized sunglasses. Atlas lay under her table, his big paws crossed, but his ears swiveled like radar dishes, scanning for frequencies the human ear couldn't perceive. Jack watched as Clara picked up her phone, her gestures animated as she spoke to someone on the other end. She was likely calling a lawyer or a town official, believing in the naive notion that rules and regulations were shields that could protect her. Jack took a slow sip of coffee, his eyes narrowed. He knew better. In the real world, rules were just lines in the sand, easily washed away by the tide of greed and violence. Soon enough, the threat revealed itself. Two men emerged from a black SUV, parked illegally in a loading zone at the end of the block. They didn't walk like tourists admiring the architecture. They moved with the deliberate arrogance of men who believed they owned the sidewalk beneath their feet. The leader was a man named Vincent Thorne, a sharp-featured individual with slicked back hair and a suit that cost more than most people's cars but still managed to look cheap on him. His eyes were cold and calculating, constantly moving like a viper looking for a place to strike. Flanking him was Rocco, a stark contrast in every way. Rocco was a mountain of a man, with a thick neck and a heavy brow, with hands like shovels and a look that suggested the lights were on, but nobody was home. He was the hammer to Thorn's scalpel. Jack shifted slightly in his chair, his body relaxing into a state of coiled readiness. He watched as they approached Clara, their shadows falling over her table before they even spoke. Atlas sensed them first. The German shepherd, who had been resting peacefully, went instantly rigid. A low, deep-throated growl vibrated from his chest. It was a sound so deep it seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The hackles along his spine rose in a stiff ridge. Clara flinched, dropping her pen, and looked up to see Thorn looming over her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Jack couldn't hear the words from this distance, but he could read the body language perfectly. Thorn placed one hand on the back of the empty chair opposite Clara, leaning in with an invasive familiarity. He tapped a finger on the stack of papers Clara had been reviewing. Land deeds, Jack guessed, or perhaps lowball purchase offers. Clara shook her head firmly, her posture straightening as she gestured toward the street, clearly telling them to leave. Thorn didn't back down immediately. He laughed, a short, contemptuous bark, and glanced down at Atlas. The dog launched himself to the end of his leash, his jaws snapping inches from Thorn's expensive trousers. Thorn jumped back, his composure cracking for a second to reveal a flash of true malice. Rocco stepped forward, his hand twitching toward his waistband, but Thorn held up a hand to stop him. After one last, lingering stare at Clara, the two men turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of a brick building. Clara was trembling. She bent down to hug Atlas, burying her face in his fur, trying to draw strength from the animal. Then, she picked up her phone again, dialing frantically. Jack sighed. She was likely reporting harassment, filing a police report that would sit in a drawer until it was too late. He knew he couldn't approach her directly yet. She would see him as just another strange man watching her. Instead, he placed a few bills on the table and stood. If he was going to protect her, he needed to know the enemy. He moved silently, following the path Thorn and Rocco had taken. He found them 2 blocks away, standing in a secluded alley behind an old movie theater, away from the prying eyes of the public. Jack ducked into the recessed doorway of a closed antique shop, using the shadows for cover. He was close enough now to hear their voices, the sound carrying clearly in the humid alley air. "She's a tough one. I'll give her that," Thorn was saying, lighting a cigarette with an angry flick of a lighter. He paced back and forth, his dress shoes clicking on the pavement. "The boss is getting impatient. The development deal for that land has to be finalized by the end of the month, or the investors are going to walk. We offered her twice the market value, and she looked at me like I was offering her dirt." Thorn spit on the ground, his frustration palpable. He was a man used to getting what he wanted through money or manipulation, and Clara's refusal was an affront to his ego. "So, we just take it?" Rocco asked, his voice a low rumble, cracking his knuckles. "I could go back there. Create an accident. Make her scared to be alone in that big old house." "No," Thorn hissed, smoke curling from his nostrils. "Too messy. The police are already watching the zoning for the land. We can't touch her directly. Not yet. If she gets hurt, the property goes into probate, and will be tied up in court for years." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he took a long drag from the cigarette. A cruel smile of enlightenment spread across his face. "She's not afraid for herself. Did you see the way she clung to that dog? That beast is the only thing keeping her sane. It's her crutch." Jack felt a cold dread crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. He studied Thorn's face, seeing the shift from corporate greed to personal vengeance. Thorn dropped the cigarette and ground it out under his heel, crushing it into the asphalt with unnecessary force. "We don't have to hurt her," Thorn said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was far more menacing than a shout. "We just have to break her spirit. If we take away the guardian, the castle falls. Tonight, we start pushing harder. But if she doesn't sign by the end of the week," Thorn looked at Rocco, his expression dead. "You go for the dog. You put a bullet in that animal, and she'll sign anything just to get away from the memory." Rocco grinned, a slow, ugly expression. "Consider it done." Jack had heard enough. He slipped out of the alley before they could spot him, his heart pounding with a cold, controlled rage. It was just as he had feared. These weren't just developers. They were predators who had identified their prey's emotional weak point. Clara thought she was fighting a legal battle over land, but she was really in a war for her soul. As he walked back toward the main street, Jack's mind began to churn, forming a plan. He knew the law wouldn't act on a threat overheard in an alley. By the time the police responded to a call about a dead dog, Clara would already be broken. He stopped at a crosswalk, looking in the direction of Clara's property. A line had been crossed. They had threatened the innocent, both the woman and the loyal beast that protected her. And in Jack's world, that kind of threat demanded a response that had nothing to do with paperwork. He was no longer just an observer on leave. He was an operative with a mission. The hunt was on. The drive back to the Morgan family property was a trip through a time tunnel. The road, narrow and unpaved, wound deep into the rural farmland outside Havenwood, flanked on both sides by massive, ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel for centuries. Their branches, heavy with leaves, intertwined overhead to obscure the dying sun, plunging the road into a premature twilight. Clara Morgan gripped the steering wheel of her old station wagon until her knuckles were white. The meeting with the town zoning official had been a dead end, just another wall of bureaucracy designed to wear her down. The radio was off, leaving only the sound of the tires crunching on the gravel and the rhythmic breathing of Atlas in the back seat. The German shepherd sensed her anxiety. He paced restlessly, occasionally resting his heavy head on her shoulder from behind the seat, offering a silent comfort that was the only thing keeping her from pulling the car over and crying. She checked her rearview mirror constantly, her heart rate spiking at every shadow. But the road behind her remained empty. She tried to convince herself that the encounter at the diner was just intimidation, that men like Thorn were bullies who would back down when ignored. She was wrong. As she came around the final blind curve a mile from her driveway, Clara slammed on the brakes. A large, black pickup truck was parked sideways across the road, completely blocking the path. No lights, no hazard flashers, just a wall of steel in the gloom. Dust billowed around her car as she skidded to a stop. Her first instinct was to throw the car in reverse, to turn and flee back to the perceived safety of the town. But before she could shift gears, a violent impact shattered the driver's side window. Glass exploded inward, showering her with tiny crystals of safety glass. Clara screamed, covering her face as a massive hand reached in and unlocked the door. It was Rocco. The brute had been waiting in the brush, blending into the shadows like a predator. He yanked the door open with terrifying force. Clara tried to scramble over to the passenger side, but Rocco grabbed her by the arm and hauled her out onto the gravel road like a rag doll. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of her, sharp stones digging into her palms. Let her go. The voice was Thorn's, smooth and chillingly calm, cutting through the chaos. He stepped out from the shadows of the truck, holding a leather portfolio. He looked immaculate, his suit unwrinkled despite the humidity, a stark contrast to the violence his associate was committing. Rocco stepped back but continued to loom over Clara. A heavy steel baton was now in his hand. From the open car door, a black missile launched into the fray. Atlas was out. With a roar that sounded more like a lion than a dog, he launched himself at Rocco in a flying leap, his jaws aimed at the giant's throat. Rocco, however, was ready. He swung the steel baton viciously. The metal connected with Atlas's ribs with a sickening thud. The dog yelped, a high-pitched sound of pain that tore through Clara's heart, and was knocked sideways to the ground. But Atlas didn't stay down. Whimpering, favoring his left side, the German shepherd staggered to his feet, teeth bared, planting himself between Clara and the men. He was hurt, his breathing ragged, but he was unbowed. Call him off, Clara, Thorn warned, stepping closer. He pulled a pistol from inside his jacket, a sleek silver automatic that caught the last rays of light filtering through the canopy. He didn't point it at her. He aimed it squarely at Atlas's head. I don't like dogs. They're messy, and they're loud. Clara scrambled to her knees, her hands finding Atlas's collar, pulling the growling animal into her lap. She could feel his heart hammering against hers, his fur bristling with rage. What do you want? She sobbed, her voice trembling. I told you, I'm not selling. Thorn sighed like a frustrated teacher dealing with a slow child. He opened the leather portfolio and tossed a document on the ground in front of her, followed by a pen. The offer has changed, he said. The price is now considerably lower. A convenience fee, let's call it, for making us come all the way out here. He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers, though he kept the gun trained on the dog. You have a choice to make, Clara. A very simple, binary choice. You sign that paper, transfer the deed, and walk away. Or, he cocked the pistol, the mechanical click echoing in the silence of the woods. Or you choose who dies first, you or the beast. The cruelty of the game was suffocating. Thorn was enjoying this. He watched her eyes dart from the paper to the gun, savoring her terror. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a sadist who fed on control. Personally, Thorn mused, tapping the barrel of the gun against his chin. I'd shoot the dog first. Watch the light go out of its eyes, since I know it's the only family you have left. And then, when you're truly alone, well, accidents happen out here in the country. Clara looked at the paper. It was just land. It was just a house. It was wood and brick and soil. Then she looked at Atlas. The dog looked up at her, his amber eyes filled with pain, but also an unwavering devotion. He licked the tears from her cheek, ignoring the man with the gun. He was ready to die for her. In that moment, the fear that had paralyzed Clara dissolved, replaced by a fierce, maternal protectiveness. She realized that without Atlas, the house was just a tomb. With him, it was home. "No," Clara whispered. "I'm sorry?" Thorn frowned, his smile faltering. "I said no." Clara screamed. She didn't reach for the pen. Instead, she launched herself forward, over Atlas, shielding his body with her own, burying her face in his neck. She curled into a ball, completely covering the dog, leaving her own back exposed to the gunman. "You want to shoot him? You have to go through me. Shoot me. Go ahead. But you will not touch him." The air grew tense. Thorn stood up, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. His game had backfired. He had expected her to grovel, to plead, to sign away her heritage to save a life. He hadn't counted on love. He hadn't counted on the strength of a woman who had lost everything once and refused to lose again. Rocco shifted uncomfortably, looking to his boss for a command. "Have it your way, you stupid woman," Thorn hissed. He raised the gun, aiming for the back of Clara's head. The silence of the forest stretched on, broken only by Clara's choked sobs and the low, defiant growl of the dog beneath her. Thorn steadied the weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger, ready to end the standoff with a permanent solution. The trees seemed to lean in, bearing witness to the moment when greed prepared to extinguish love. The hammerfall of Thorn's silver automatic sounded like a thunderclap in the silent, leaf-canopied tunnel of the road. Time seemed to hang suspended in that moment, heavy and suffocating over Clara's trembling form. But before Thorn's finger could complete the final millimeter of pressure required to end a life, the darkness to his right erupted. It wasn't a chaotic movement, but a precise, calculated strike of kinetic energy. Jack Donovan didn't emerge from the shadows. He became them, moving with a speed the human eye could barely track. He was a blur of gray and denim, closing the distance between the tree line and the gunman in one fluid motion. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't offer a chance to surrender. In his world, when a weapon was drawn on a civilian, negotiations were over. Jack's left hand chopped down on Thorn's wrist, diverting the barrel toward the ground just as a reflex caused Thorn to squeeze the trigger. The shot went wide, burying itself harmlessly in the gravel with a sharp crack that sent birds scattering from the canopy above. Simultaneously, Jack stepped inside Thorn's guard, using his own hip as a fulcrum. He gripped the man's forearm and twisted it against the joint's natural rotation. There was a dry, sickening snap, the unmistakable sound of a radius bone breaking under extreme torque. Thorn screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure agony, and the pistol dropped from his useless fingers. Jack caught the weapon mid-air with his right hand before it hit the ground. A move drilled 1,000 times in kill houses and deserts half a world away. With a shove that had the force of a battering ram, Jack sent the screaming man staggering back to the ground. Rocco, the giant henchman, roared in surprise and charged forward, raising his steel baton to crush this new intruder. He was big and he was strong, but he fought like a bar brawler. Jack was a surgeon of violence. As Rocco swung, Jack didn't step back. He stepped into the arc of the swing, jamming the barrel of the captured pistol hard into Rocco's sternum. The impact drove the air from the big man's lungs, freezing him in place. Jack didn't fire. Instead, he looked up into Rocco's eyes with a gaze completely devoid of fear or anger. It was a look of cold professional detachment. "Get him out of here," Jack said, his voice low and even, cutting through Thorn's whimpers like a razor. "Or the next one goes in your kneecap." Rocco looked at the gun pressed into his chest, then at his boss writhing in the dirt, clutching his broken arm, and finally at the man standing before him. He saw something in Jack's gray eyes that terrified him more than any police siren ever could. He saw a man who had walked through hell and come back with the keys. The bully in Rocco evaporated. He dropped the baton, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender, and backed away. He grabbed the back of Thorn's expensive suit, hauling the sobbing man to his feet. They stumbled toward their truck, casting fearful glances over their shoulders, realizing they had kicked a hornet's nest they were not equipped to handle. Jack kept the pistol trained on them, his finger alongside the frame, not the trigger, maintaining perfect discipline until they scrambled into the truck's cab. The engine roared to life, tires spinning in the gravel as the vehicle fishtailed violently before speeding off into the deepening night. Only when the red taillights vanished around the bend did Jack lower the weapon. He engaged the safety and tucked it into the waistband at the small of his back. The threat was gone, for now. He turned immediately to the woman on the ground. Clara hadn't moved. She was still curled over Atlas, her body shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline dump had hit her hard, the gunshot, the sound of breaking bone, the sudden explosion of violence. It was too much for a soul already fractured by grief. "Clara," Jack said softly, his voice shifting from a soldier's command to something gentler. "It's over. They're gone." Clara looked up, her eyes wide and unfocused, her pupils dilated with shock. She looked at Jack, but she didn't seem to recognize him at first. Her breaths were short and shallow, like the sound of tearing paper. He was going to, she stammered, her hands clenched so tightly in the dog's fur that her knuckles were white. The gun. Atlas. The world was spinning around her. The stress of the past months, the grief for her husband, the terror of this moment, it all crashed down on her at once like a tidal wave. Her eyes rolled back in her head, her hands went slack, and she slumped to the ground, unconscious. "Clara." Jack was at her side in an instant, kneeling. He checked her pulse immediately, fast, but strong. She had simply fainted from the overwhelming stress, a vasovagal syncope. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He then turned his attention to the dog. Atlas was whining softly, nudging his wet nose against Clara's limp hand. The German Shepherd was favoring his left side where the baton had struck. Jack ran an expert hand over the dog's ribcage. Atlas flinched but didn't snap. He seemed to understand the man was trying to help. "Cracked ribs, probably bruised," Jack murmured to himself. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" Jack knew he couldn't leave them here. The road was dark, unsecure, and the thugs might come back with reinforcements once the shock wore off. He needed to move. He stood and gathered Clara into his arms. She felt impossibly light, like a bird with hollow bones. Her head lolled against his chest, her dark hair spilling over his arm. He adjusted his grip, holding her securely, and looked at the dog. "Can you walk, soldier?" he asked. Atlas struggled to his feet, letting out a pained huff of air, but held his ground. The dog looked at Clara in Jack's arms, then at Jack, and gave a short, sharp bark. He was ready to follow. Jack started walking back the way he had come, toward where his own truck was hidden a few hundred yards away up a logging trail. He walked with a steady, rhythmic pace, carrying the unconscious woman as if she were a precious asset recovered from a battlefield. Atlas limped beside him, pressing his body against Jack's leg for reassurance from time to time. The three of them moved through the darkness, leaving the scene of violence behind. As he walked, Jack's mind began processing the tactical situation. He had let them go. It was a risk, a tactical error, perhaps, in a war zone. But here, with a civilian casualty and a wounded animal, extraction had been the priority. He couldn't pursue them and leave Clara vulnerable. He had made a choice to save, not to eliminate. When they reached his truck, Jack carefully placed Clara in the passenger seat, reclining it so she could rest comfortably. He lifted Atlas into the back, wincing in sympathy as the dog whimpered, and settled him on a blanket. Before getting into the driver's seat, Jack paused. He pulled the captured silver automatic from his waistband and weighed it in his hand. It was cold and heavy and smelled of gun oil. It was tangible proof of the line that had been crossed. He looked back down the road toward the empty darkness where Thorn and Rocco had fled. The silence of the woods returned, filled now only with the chirp of crickets. But to Jack, the silence was screaming. He stood there for a long moment, his form framed by the moonlight filtering through the trees, his jaw set in a hard line, the muscles in his neck taut. They thought they could use fear as a weapon. They thought they were the predators. They had no idea they had just been hunting in the wrong forest. Jack tucked the gun into his glove compartment, his eyes cold and unforgiving. He had saved her tonight, but the war had just been declared. "Not next time," he whispered to the empty road, a vow made to the darkness. "Next time, you don't get away." He climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove them away from the nightmare, toward the only place he knew would be safe. The Morgan family homestead emerged from the darkness like a memory preserved in amber, a sprawling Victorian farmhouse stark against the moonlit Ohio farmlands. It was a structure of soaring peaks and wraparound porches, built in an era when homes were designed to weather the seasons. Jack drove his truck up the long gravel driveway, the tires crunching softly, a sound that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence of the night. He killed the headlights before they reached the house, letting the vehicle roll to a stop near the back entrance, obscured by the shadows of the ancient oaks. The adrenaline from the roadside confrontation had subsided into a cold, hard focus. He was no longer reacting. He was planning. He carried Clara into the house, kicking the door shut behind him with his heel. The interior smelled of lavender and old paper, a scent of comfort that stood in stark contrast to the blood and fear of the last hour. He gently laid her on the oversized floral sofa in the living room, checking her vitals once more. Her pulse was stabilizing, her breathing deepening into a natural rhythm. She was safe for the moment, but his attention was immediately drawn to the night's other victim. Atlas had followed them inside, his claws clicking unevenly on the hardwood floors. The big dog stood in the middle of the room, trembling slightly, his breath shallow and panting. The blow from the baton had taken its toll. Jack moved to the kitchen, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and returned with a bowl of water and a first aid kit he'd retrieved from his truck, a military-grade trauma kit that had seen more sand than suburbs. He knelt in front of the dog. "Come on, soldier," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave into a soft, reassuring rumble. Atlas hesitated, his amber eyes flickering to Clara's sleeping form and then back to the man. Slowly, painfully, the dog lowered himself onto the rug, exposing his injured side. It was a profound act of submission, a recognition of alpha status. Jack's hands, scarred and calloused from years of handling weapons and rough terrain, moved with surprising gentleness. He wet a cloth and cleaned the dirt from the dog's fur, then began probing the ribs with light, practiced fingers. Atlas let out a thin, high whimper, but he didn't pull away. He nudged his muzzle against Jack's knee, seeking comfort. "You took a hell of a hit, didn't you?" Jack whispered, applying a cooling gel and wrapping the dog's torso with a compression bandage to stabilize the ribs. "But you held the line. Good boy." The image of the hardened warrior tending to the wounded animal was a study in contrasts. Violence and healing coexisted in the same pair of hands. As he finished the wrapping, he felt eyes on him. He looked up to see Clara sitting up on the sofa, her eyes open, filled with a dawning, confused awareness. She watched him stroking the dog's head, her hand flying to her mouth as the memory of the ambush came rushing back. "You saved us," she said, her voice a trembling whisper. It wasn't a question. Jack sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on a rag. "I was just evening the odds," he replied quietly. "How are you feeling?" "Like I just woke up in a different life," Clara admitted, pulling her knees to her chest. She looked around the room, her sanctuary, which now felt so fragile. "They're not going to stop, are they?" "He said a lot of things," Jack cut in, gently but firmly. "But talk is cheap. Tell me why, Clara. Why this house? Why are they willing to kill for it?" Clara took a shaky breath, her eyes drifting to a framed photo on the mantelpiece, a black and white picture of a man in a military uniform, standing in front of this very house. "It's not just a house," she explained, her voice gaining strength. "It's been in the Morgan family for 4 generations. My husband, David, he was killed overseas 2 years ago. This place, and Atlas, they're all I have left of him. Thorn represents a development corporation. They want to dredge the wetlands, build condos, pave over everything that makes this land breathe. They offered money, then they offered threats. Now," she gestured helplessly toward the window. "Now they want blood." Jack nodded slowly. It was the oldest story in the world. Greed trying to pave over history. But hearing it from her, seeing the fierce protection in her eyes, changed something in him. This was no longer just a rescue mission. It was the defense of sacred ground. "We can't leave," Jack stated, getting to his feet and beginning to pace the room. His eyes swept the windows, the doors, the sight lines. "If we run, they win. And if we go to the local sheriff, we have no idea who's on Thorn's payroll." He'd been too confident about the zoning, too sure of his immunity. "So, what do we do?" Clara asked, fear flickering in her eyes again. "We fortify," Jack said, his voice decisive. "We make this place something they can't swallow." He moved through the room with a new purpose, throwing dead bolts, drawing heavy curtains, and moving furniture to create choke points and cover. He was turning the cozy, inviting farmhouse into a forward operating base. Clara watched him, and for the first time since David's death, she didn't feel like a victim waiting for the next blow. She felt like she had an army. Jack went back to his military pack, which he'd set by the door. He unzipped a hidden compartment at the bottom, revealing a device that looked out of place among the antique furniture, a small, ruggedized GPS and satellite communications unit. It was black, utilitarian, and hummed with a faint electronic potential. This was his lifeline, a link to a world that operated above the corruption of small-town politics. He knew the local sheriff couldn't be trusted. Thorn's arrogance confirmed that he needed someone who answered to a higher authority. He typed in a sequence of commands, the device's small screen glowing green in the dim light. He wasn't calling 911. He was sending an encrypted distress signal to a specific coordinate tagged with a priority level. "Who are you calling?" Clara whispered, watching the blinking device. "A friend," Jack answered, His eyes locked on the screen as the signal locked. Someone who hates bullies as much as I do. He was thinking of Lieutenant Miller, a state police officer he'd served with on a joint task force years ago. She was relentless, incorruptible, and she owed him a favor. More importantly, she operated outside the jurisdiction of the local swamp rats Thorn had in his pocket. The device beeped once, a solid tone indicating the message was received. Jack let out a breath, a fraction of the tension leaving his shoulders. The cavalry was coming, but it would take time. Until then, it was him, Clara, and a wounded dog against whatever darkness was waiting in the woods. He looked at Clara, then at Atlas, who had limped over to rest his head on Jack's boot again. "Try to get some sleep," Jack told her, pulling a chair to face the front door and checking the magazine of the silver pistol he'd taken from Thorn. "I'll take the first watch." The storm was coming, but inside the fortress of the Morgan homestead, the line had been drawn. The storm arrived not with a whisper, but with a violence that shook the very foundations of the farmland. Thunder rolled across the flatlands like cannon fire, the sound vibrating up through the floorboards of the Morgan homestead. Rain lashed the siding in sheets, driven by a wind that howled through the old oaks, turning their branches into bony fingers that clawed at the roof. Inside, the warm glow of the lamps flickered once, twice, and then died. The house was plunged into an oppressive blackness, broken only by the intermittent flashes of lightning that illuminated the room in stark, ghostly tableaus. Clara gasped, dropping the blanket she had wrapped around herself. The sudden loss of light was like a physical blow, stripping away the illusion of safety she had built over the last hour. She fumbled in the dark, her hands trembling. "Clara! Stay put." Jack's voice came out of the darkness, calm and disembodied. "Don't move until your eyes adjust." A moment later, a small, shielded beam from a tactical flashlight cut through the gloom. Jack moved through the room, not with the stumbling hesitation of a civilian, but with the fluid grace of a creature in its natural environment. He went to the window, peering through a slit in the heavy drapes he'd drawn earlier. Outside, amidst the chaos of the storm, he saw them. 2 vehicles had pulled up at the end of the long driveway, their lights off. Figures detached themselves from the shadows of the tree line. There were more this time. Thorn hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to erase a mistake. He'd brought reinforcements. Among the familiar bulk of Rocco, there was a new figure. Through the rain-streaked glass, lit for a brief second by a fork of lightning, Jack saw a man who moved differently from the others. He was thin, wiry, and dressed in dark, practical clothing instead of a cheap suit. He carried a pry bar and a heavy tool bag. This was the specialist, a professional locksmith, someone hired not for loyalty, but for his ability to bypass locks and disable alarm systems without leaving a trace. He had a sharp, angular face and cold, emotionless eyes that swept the house with professional detachment. Thorn was desperate. He knew that if the gun Jack had taken, a gun registered in his name, made it to the authorities, his career and his freedom were over. He was throwing everything he had at this house to get it back. "They cut the power," Jack announced, moving back into the room. "Phone lines will be next if they aren't already." He moved into the kitchen, his boots making no sound. Clara followed him, clutching the back of his shirt like a lifeline. She watched, confused, as he began to rifle through her pantry and utility drawers. He wasn't looking for weapons. He was looking for geometry. He pulled out a spool of high-test fishing line, a bag of white flour, and a box of light bulbs. "What are you doing?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "Creating a home field advantage," Jack replied. He moved to the hallway and the foyer, the most likely points of entry. He stretched the fishing line taut across the floor at ankle height, invisible in the dark, but strong enough to trip a man in a hurry. Then, he took the bag of flour and dusted the floor near the back entrance and at the hallway junction. "In the dark, I can't see them," he explained, gesturing to the white powder. "But if they step here, they'll leave a trail. I'll know exactly where they are and where they're going." Finally, he took the light bulbs, wrapped them in a cloth, and gently crushed them under his boot. He sprinkled the shards beneath the windows in the utility room. An early warning system. Broken glass is loud. Clara watched him work, her terror mixing with a sense of awe. He was taking her home apart. Yet, she had never felt safer. He wasn't just reacting. He was shaping the battlefield. He led her to the space beneath the main staircase, a small, enclosed closet used for storage. It had thick walls and was defensible. "Get in," he instructed, handing her a heavy flashlight, but keeping it off. "Atlas stays with you. He's injured, and if he barks, he'll give away my position. Keep him calm. If someone opens this door and it's not me," he paused, looking at her with a burning intensity. "You scream. You scream as loud as you can. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face, and pulled the limping dog into the small space with her. Atlas whined softly, sensing the separation, but settled as Clara buried her face in his neck. Jack closed the door until it was just barely ajar, leaving them in the security of the darkness. He moved back to the center of the living room. He holstered the silver pistol he'd taken from Thorn, but didn't draw it. He wanted them to feel safe coming in. He wanted them deep inside the web before the spider moved. The storm outside intensified, the wind battering the house in a physical assault, masking the sounds of their approach, but Jack's senses were tuned to a different frequency. He closed his eyes, filtering out the thunder, listening for the unnatural sounds, the clink of metal on metal, the creak of a floorboard, the labored breath of men fueled by adrenaline and bad intentions. And then it came. From the east wing of the house near the library came the distinct sound of shattering glass. It wasn't the wind. A window had been breached. The shards of the light bulbs Jack had laid crunched under a heavy boot. They were in. Jack clicked off his tactical light. The house was plunged into absolute blackness. He was no longer Jack Donovan, the man on leave. He was a ghost. He moved toward the library, his steps silent, his breathing even. As he passed the closet under the stairs, he paused for a fraction of a second, whispering into the void, a promise for the woman trembling in fear in the darkness. "Trust me." And then he was gone, melting into the shadows. The hunt had begun. The intruders thought they were breaking into a house occupied by a helpless woman and a dog. They didn't realize they had just stepped into a cage with something far more dangerous than the storm outside. The house was no longer a home. It was a labyrinth of darkness and silence, breathing with the rhythm of the storm outside. The blackness was total, a thick, velvet curtain that swallowed the intruders whole, stripping them of their confidence. Jack moved through the dark, not by sight, but by memory and instinct. He had memorized the creak of every floorboard during his preparations, and now he used that knowledge to become an apparition. He crouched behind a heavy oak armchair in the corner of the living room, listening. The crunch of boots on the hardwood floor was distinct. There were 3 of them, moving through the foyer. The specialist, followed by the hulking mass of Rocco, and finally Thorn, whose erratic breathing betrayed his desperation. They were sweeping the ground floor, their tactical flashlights cutting narrow, jerky beams through the dusty air. They were hunting, but they didn't realize they were the ones being herded. The specialist took the lead, his flashlight beam scanning low. He was careful, professional. He spotted the fishing line Jack had strung across the hallway entrance just before he walked through it. "Watch your step," the specialist hissed to the others. "He's rigged the place." But as the specialist stepped over the line, his boot landed in the fine layer of white flour Jack had dusted near the threshold. A puff of white powder rose into the air, and a distinct white footprint was left on the dark wood. Jack smiled in the darkness. He didn't need to see them. He just needed to follow the white ghosts they left behind. As the specialist passed the armchair, Jack struck. He didn't use a weapon. He rose from the shadows like a phantom, his arm hooking around the specialist's neck in a rear-naked choke. The man struggled for a second, dropping his flashlight, which spun on the floor, casting dizzying shadows across the walls. Jack squeezed, compressing the carotid arteries. In seconds, the specialist went limp. Jack lowered him silently to the floor and was gone, back into the shadows before Rocco or Thorn could turn. "Where did he go?" Thorn whispered, his voice trembling. "He was just here," Rocco growled, swinging his heavy baton through the empty air. "Come on out, soldier boy. No more games." From the darkness of the hallway, a low, menacing growl echoed. It was Atlas. The dog hadn't stayed in the closet. He had sensed the threat to his pack and had limped out to join the fight. The growl was like a ventriloquist's trick, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the animal's location. Rocco turned toward the sound, distracted. It was the opening Jack needed. He launched himself at Rocco, his shoulder driving into the giant's midsection. The impact sent both men crashing into a side table, shattering a lamp. Rocco was powerful, fueled by rage, and he managed to shove Jack off. He raised the baton to bring it down for a killing blow, his silhouette framed by a flash of lightning. Suddenly, a blinding cloud of white powder exploded in Rocco's face. Clara had emerged from the shadows of the dining room. She was done hiding. In her hands, she held a heavy red fire extinguisher. She had pulled the pin and unleashed a stream of chemical foam directly into Rocco's eyes. The giant roared, blinded and choking, dropping his weapon to claw at his face. Jack didn't hesitate. He swept Rocco's legs out from under him and delivered a precise, disabling blow to his temple. The giant crashed to the floor, unconscious. "Clara, get back." Jack commanded, but it was too late. The chaos had drawn the final predator. Thorn stood by the fireplace, the last man standing. The fear in his eyes had curdled into a dangerous, feral resolve. He'd lost his hired muscle, lost his advantage, and now he had nothing left to lose. He didn't reach for a gun. He didn't have one. Instead, he pulled a long, serrated hunting knife from his belt. The blade glinted in the flickering light of the storm. "I'm not leaving without that deed," Thorn screamed, his voice cracking. "And I'm not leaving you alive." He lunged at Jack, the knife slashing through the air. Jack dodged, but the fatigue of the fight was setting in. He backpedaled, creating distance between himself and the blade, but his foot slipped on the slick powder covering the floor. He stumbled, falling to one knee near the hearth. Thorn saw his opening. He raised the knife high, preparing to plunge it into Jack's chest. "Die!" he screamed. But he never brought the blade down. A dark blur launched itself from the floor. Atlas, despite his bruised ribs and limping leg, had sprung into the air. He didn't go for the throat. He went for the weapon. His powerful jaws clamped down on Thorn's forearm, the teeth sinking deep into the expensive suit fabric and the flesh beneath. Thorn shrieked in pain, dropping the knife as the 90-pound dog dragged his arm down, shaking his head violently. Thorn pounded on the dog with his free hand, screaming, "Get off! Get off me!" Atlas yelped as a punch landed on his injured ribs, but he refused to let go. He was buying time. Jack scrambled for the knife, but he was too far. He needed a weapon. "Jack, catch!" Clara's voice rang out, clear and defiant. She was standing by the woodpile. With all her strength, she threw a thick, seasoned oak log through the air. It wasn't a perfect throw, tumbling end over end, but Jack's reflexes were honed by war. He reached up and snatched the log out of the air. With a roar of exertion, Jack swung the heavy log like a baseball bat. It connected with the side of Thorn's jaw. There was a sickening crack, not of bone, but of the fight, leaving a man's body all at once. Thorn's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. Atlas released his arm instantly, backing away to sit beside Jack, panting, his muzzle slick with blood that was not his own. Silence rushed into the room, heavier than before, broken only by the rain and their own ragged breathing. The floor was littered with the bodies of defeated men. Jack dropped the log, his chest heaving. He looked at Atlas, and then at Clara. She stood amidst the wreckage of her living room, covered in a fine dusting of white powder, the fire extinguisher still clutched in her hands. She wasn't trembling anymore. She looked at the unconscious men, then met Jack's gaze. In the flickering lightning, they didn't look like victims. They looked like a pack that had defended its territory. "Is it over?" Clara whispered, stepping over Rocco's motionless form. Jack nudged the unconscious Thorn with his boot to make sure he was out. He bent down and stroked Atlas's head, feeling the dog lean into his touch. "For tonight," Jack said, his voice raw with exhaustion, but steady. "We held the line." He looked at Clara, really looked at her. The fragile widow he had met in the park was gone. In her place was a survivor who had walked through the fire and come out the other side. The symphony of chaos was over, leaving only the quiet, resilient rhythm of their courage. The storm broke just as the first gray light began to creep over the eastern sky. The rain, which had hammered the roof like a war drum all night, softened to a gentle, rhythmic patter before ceasing altogether. In its wake, it left a world washed clean, the air smelling of wet earth, ozone, and pine. The resulting silence was profound, a heavy blanket of peace settling over the Morgan homestead, broken only by the sound of distant, approaching sirens. They weren't the wavering patrol cars of the local sheriff. These were the deep, authoritative howls of high-performance engines barreling down the country road. Jack Donovan stood on the front porch, arms crossed over his chest, watching the convoy of red and blue lights cut through the morning mist like a knife. He hadn't slept, but the exhaustion in his bones was different now. It wasn't the dragging weight of trauma. It was the satisfying ache of a job well done. Beside him, Clara Morgan sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a blanket, sipping a cup of coffee he had made for her. The trembling was gone. Her eyes were clear, watching the approaching lights with a look of steely resolve. Atlas lay at her feet, his ribs bandaged, his head on her lap, but his eyes were open, watching the driveway with the quiet vigilance of a sentry who knows relief is on its way. The cars crunched up the gravel driveway, their tires spitting stones as they fanned out in a tactical formation. These were state police, the elite response team of the highway patrol summoned by the priority distress signal Jack had sent hours before. Doors opened in unison and uniformed officers spilled out, weapons drawn but held low, moving with professional discipline. At their head was Lieutenant Miller. She was a tall woman with iron gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her face etched with the kind of experience that comes from seeing the worst of humanity and refusing to blink. She wore her uniform like armor, and her stride was all-purpose. As she approached the porch, Jack moved down the steps to meet her. They didn't exchange greetings, but the nod that passed between them carried the weight of years of mutual respect from past joint task forces. Miller looked past him at the damaged front door, the broken windows, and the three men now bound with zip ties and moaning on the living room floor inside. "You sure know how to enjoy a vacation, Donovan," Miller remarked, her voice as dry and raspy as sandpaper on wood. She motioned for her officers to enter the house and secure the prisoners. "I got your signal. We bypassed the local dispatch. Figured if you were calling, it wasn't a noise complaint." "They needed a wake-up call," Jack replied evenly, gesturing toward the house. "Thorne and his crew, breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon. Attempted murder. I preserved the evidence. The firearm is on the mantel, bagged and ready for ballistics." As the officers dragged the intruders out, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long, golden rays across the wet lawn. Thorne came first, hauled between two large troopers. His expensive suit was ruined, caked with flour and mud, his face swollen from the impact of the oak log. He saw Clara standing on the porch and opened his mouth to scream something, a threat, a plea, a lawyer's name. But the words died in his throat when he met her gaze. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She stood tall, a queen looking down on a peasant who had tried to steal her crown. Thorne slumped, defeated, and was shoved into the back of a patrol car. Rocco and the specialist followed, bruised and silent. The threat that had hung over the property like a thundercloud had been broken into pieces and was being driven away in police cruisers. The processing took hours, but by the time the sun was high, the homestead was quiet again. Miller shook Jack's hand, promising to keep the case under state jurisdiction to avoid local corruption, and led her convoy away. Jack stood in the driveway, his duffel bag packed and slung over his shoulder. His leave was officially over. The Navy needed him back. His team was gearing up for a deployment, and the world was full of other storms that needed navigating. He turned to face Clara. She had changed into fresh clothes, jeans and a simple shirt, but she wore them differently. The slump of the grieving widow was gone, replaced by the posture of a woman who had defended her home and won. "You're leaving," Clara said softly. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of a reality they both knew. "My time's up," Jack said, shifting the bag on his shoulder. "I have to report back to Virginia by tonight." Clara walked down the steps, Atlas limping bravely at her side. She stopped a few feet from him. There were 1,000 things she could have said. "Thank you. Stay. Don't go." But none of them felt big enough for the moment. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it. "You gave me back more than just this house, Jack," she said, her voice steady. "You reminded me that I can fight, that we're not alone." Jack looked down at Atlas. The dog nuzzled his hand, licking his fingers. Jack knelt one last time, scratching the thick fur behind the German shepherd's ears. "You watch over her, soldier," he whispered. Atlas gave a short, soft bark, a promise between warriors. Jack stood and looked at Clara. For the first time since he had arrived in this small Ohio town, the gray storm in his own eyes had cleared. "You didn't need me to save you, Clara. You just needed someone to stand with you while you saved yourself." He turned and walked to his truck, the gravel crunching under his boots, a sound of departure that felt final but full of hope. He threw his bag in the passenger's seat and climbed in. As he turned the key, the engine rumbled to life, breaking the stillness of the farmland one last time. He didn't look back right away. He put the truck in gear and started slowly down the winding drive, past the ancient oaks that had borne witness to violence and victory. Only when he reached the curve in the road did he glance up at his rearview mirror. Framed in the glass, bathed in the warm, golden light of the Midwestern sun, stood Clara and Atlas. They weren't looking at the ground or into the past. They were watching him, side by side, a united front of resilience. Clara raised a hand in a wave, and Atlas sat tall, his ears pricked forward. A small, genuine smile touched Jack's lips, a rare expression for a man who had seen too much darkness. He realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't driving away from a memory. He was driving away with a hope. He wasn't leaving them behind. He was securing their perimeter one last time. And as the truck disappeared around the bend, leaving the homestead in peace, Jack knew one thing for certain. The war may be calling him away, but to this place, to this peace, and to these people, he would return. The soldier had found his way home.